Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Mike Reapy. As the past president of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Council, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly speaker series, Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UC Santa Cruz faculty member in discussions with you, the local community of Silicon Valley, and our extended community online, with the goal of making all of us Renaissance people. We wanted to feel just like you're at UC Santa Cruz sitting in class, but with drinks and without tests. David, another volunteer organizer, is with me tonight. We're both alumni and spend our days in entrepreneurial companies, Silicon Valley style. He'll be helping me with the Q&A, and you'll be hearing more from him at the end. Before we get started, and since we can't see you, we'd like to know where you're zooming in from and how many people are watching. So we've just put a little poll up on your screen. Please take a few moments to fill it out, and we'll share the results after we've given everyone a moment to respond. Okay, in a moment, you should be able to see the results of the poll and who's in the virtual room with you. Looks like 30% in Santa Cruz County, mostly in the Bay Area. Good a number of people, 4% in outer space. So welcome to Space Station. So tonight we'll be tipping our steins with Professor Dr. David Brundage, who is Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz. He also lectures in Community Studies and is currently the chair of UCSC's Academic Senate. His research centers on the intersection of labor and immigration history, with a particular focus on the Irish in America. His publications include The Making of Western Labor Radicalism, Denver's Organized Workers, covering 1878 through 1905, and also The Irish Nationalists in America, The Politics of Exile, 1798 through 1998. We'll hear tonight about his next book. If you have questions for our professor, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll take a few questions at about the 15-minute mark, and then another round of Q&A at the end of the talk. Don't wait until the last minute to type in your questions. You can type them in the box at any time. If you see someone else's question that you like, please upvote it, and we'll ask that question sooner. This talk is being recorded. In a few days, you'll be able to find it on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. We'll post the link in our social media channels and follow-up emails as well. Okay, does everybody have their stein? Great. I've got your slug, Professor David Brundage.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mike and David and the Alumni Association for inviting me to speak tonight. I want to begin by saying that the talk draws on research that's still really in progress. I touched on some of the themes I'll develop here in the book on Irish nationalists in America that Mike mentioned. But I'm currently digging into archival material in New York City much more deeply than I was able to do for that book. And at the same time that I've been digging down, I've also been reading a growing body of scholarship that highlights the impact of the Easter Rising and the subsequent Irish Revolution on anti-colonial movements far beyond the small island of Ireland. And here I'll give a plug for a collection of essays entitled The Irish Revolution, A Global History, that NYU Press will be bringing out next month. I have a chapter in that book, but it also includes a number of other scholars, both in the United States and Ireland and other countries, who are working along parallel lines. So in my talk tonight, I'll draw on this growing body of scholarship, but also give it a very New York City spin, which I hope to convince you is more than appropriate in this case. So with that said, let me begin. The tumultuous process of decolonization in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the Pacific, only hit full stride after the end of World War II. I have to say, it's a funny kind of word, decolonization, an awfully bland term for what actually occurred in just 3 short decades, basically from 1945 to 75. Vast intercontinental empires of Britain, France, and the Netherlands collapsed, while scores of new independent states were created, independent nation states were created everywhere, especially in what's called the Global South. Many scholars have labeled decolonization the most important historical process of the 20th century, with the 3 decades following World War II marking nothing less than a total rupture in world history. Still, scholars have also understood that decolonization had very deep roots, and in particular, the era of the First World War gave a major boost to anti-colonial agitation, providing a kind of dress rehearsal for later developments. So that there's agreement on that, but why this was so has been a matter of debate. And some of our most influential historians have emphasized the important role of Woodrow Wilson and his ideas in this period. However, tonight I'm going to take a different approach and try to show the centrality of the 1916 Easter Rising and the subsequent Irish Revolution, the long struggle to win independence for colonized peoples around the world. So I'm going to share my screen here in a second. It's going to take a second, I think. And kind of a lot on the screen there, but can you see the basic image? Can someone nod or something and tell me? Can see it basically? Great. Is that true? Okay.
Looks good. Thanks, David.
It looks good. Okay. So this is Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And there's really no question that Wilson, who was president of the US from 1913 to 1921, cast this just giant shadow over international politics. Many scholars today are skeptical, I would say, of the sincerity of the president's commitment to, I know you all have heard the phrase, making the world safe for democracy. But even with that skepticism, people really put a lot of emphasis on his ideas. And in particular, the Harvard historian Erez Manella has argued that Wilson's lofty rhetoric in the closing months of World War I had profound, if unintended, consequences. So let me just give you a bit of the flavor of what Manella is trying to argue in a quote. For colonized, marginalized, and stateless peoples from all over the world, Chinese and Koreans, Arabs and Jews, Armenians and Kurds, the American president was an icon for their aspirations and a potential champion of their cause, committed, as he had himself declared, to the principle of self-determination for all peoples. Now, to be sure, many of these groups, in fact, almost all of the groups I just mentioned, were deeply disappointed by the actual results of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference that Wilson dominated. But still, Manella argues the heady period from the fall of 1918 to the spring of the following year, period he calls the Wilsonian moment, helped shape the eventual course of decolonization. Now, for sure, this is a stimulating argument, and I think generally persuasive one as well. But at least in my view, it's not the whole story. For at least some of those colonized, marginalized, and stateless peoples that Manella refers to, it was not Wilson's America, but another nation that did the most to stir their hopes and imaginations. And that nation was Ireland. And I think this is true for 4 main reasons. First, the Irish Revolution that began with the 1916 Easter Rising provided a potent example of the ability of just a handful of militants to challenge a great empire, in the case of Britain, the largest empire in the world. Second, the willingness of dedicated rebels during the Rising and afterwards to lay down their own lives for the sake of a larger cause proved to be deeply inspiring to a variety of other anti-colonial figures. Third, for those activists who were residing in the US in this period, and that's the group I'm focusing on, there was another factor at work. In linking their own struggles to that of Ireland, they were fastening onto a national cause with by far the most favorable American publicity and popular enthusiasm. And finally, as the Irish Revolution unfolded, a number of Irish Americans themselves began to reach out and make connections with activists from other national groups, and in so doing intensified the attraction of the Irish model. Now, the single most important meeting ground for these diverse figures, and some of whom you'll meet tonight, was New York City. And at least from the Irish point of view, that this isn't surprising. From the earliest days of the American Republic, the city had been a major focal point for all varieties of Irish nationalism. In the 1840s, Daniel O'Connell's nonviolent constitutional movement to repeal the Act of Union that cemented Ireland and Great Britain, but O'Connell sought to repeal, built tremendous strength there in New York City, but so did the revolutionary Irish Republican Brotherhood, commonly known as the Fenians, in the 1860s and 1870s. As Dennis Clark, the great historian of the Irish in America, once put it, New York was the overseas capital of Irish nationalist agitation. But as an increasingly cosmopolitan magnet that attracted a wide variety of immigrants, exiles, students, visiting politicians, visiting intellectuals from many different parts of the globe, New York was also, what the literary scholar Mary Louise Pratt has called a contact zone, a space, and I'm quoting her now, in which peoples geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other. So when I get to the main part of my talk, I'll try to explore the implications of this idea with special attention to the growth and interaction of three important anti-colonial movements: Irish nationalism, of course, the Indian independence movement, and the movement called Pan-Africanism. Now, all three were classic examples of what some scholars have labeled long-distance nationalism. And what it's a very simple idea. It's the phenomenon of nationalist activity and enthusiasm over long distances among far-flung groups of immigrants, exiles, or diasporas. All three of these groups had a significant presence in New York. So before I get into my current research, I think I should give you a very brief overview of the Easter Rising itself. For starters, you should know as background that as the 20th century opened, the dominant wing of Irish nationalism was the constitutional one, represented by John Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party. Its goal was an extremely moderate one. The goal was home rule, meaning very limited autonomy within the framework of the United Kingdom. Redmond had built an alliance with the powerful British Liberal Party, and because of that alliance, it looked like home rule might actually come to pass. It's true there was resistance, and the resistance came mainly from the people we call unionists in the heavily Protestant Northern Irish province of Ulster. But things were nonetheless looking pretty bright for moderate Irish nationalism. That is until the outbreak of World War I in August 1914. When the war began, Redmond agreed to an indefinite postponement of home rule and then went on to turn his party into a kind of recruiting machine for the British Army. Now, at this point, acting on an old Irish piece of wisdom, I suppose, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, a very small group, just a handful of figures from the more militant wing of Irish nationalism began to think about how to use the war to their advantage. And we call these folks Irish Republicans because their ultimate goal was not home rule, but a fully independent Irish Republic. Irish Republicans should not be confused with American Republicans. It's not the American Republican Party, the GOP, a very distinctive and distinctively Irish political sentiment and tradition. So these Irish Republicans began to make contacts both with the German government, of course, the enemy, and a secret revolutionary organization in the US called Clan na Gael, Family of the Gaels, Family of the Irish. And a military council within the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Dublin began planning a rising as early as May 1915. This group reached out to a schoolmaster and poet named Patrick Pearse, a small number of other key leaders in an organization called the Irish Volunteers. That was an armed militia originally organized to support home rule, not a revolutionary body at all. In January 1916, they were joined by James Connolly, a prominent socialist and labor activist. Connolly had been a leader of the Dublin workers during their bitter 1913 lockout there, and he commanded its so-called Irish Citizen Army, which had been set up to defend workers from attacks by the Dublin police during that conflict. Their headquarters was a building in central London that they had called Liberty Hall. Now, Connolly denounced World War I when it began as an imperialist war, but he soon came to see it, as did the other Irish Republicans, as an opportunity for an insurrection against British rule in Ireland. In early 1916, he committed the citizen army to participation in the rising. Now, the actual military strategy behind the rising remains murky to this day. And historians are really confused about what it was all about, or uncertain or disagree about what it was all about. The original plan called for general rebellion throughout the country. It was supposed to begin on Easter Sunday, April 23rd, 1916. But unfortunately for them, on Saturday, the 22nd, the British captured a German steamship that was carrying rifles and machine guns to arm the Irish insurgents. And so things looked like they were collapsing, but at this point, the leaders decided to go ahead and stage a rising in Dublin anyway on Easter Monday with whatever forces and arms they could pull together. And, you know, to be honest, it seems crazy to us now, or a desperate roll of the dice without any hope of military success. But actually, even before then, and maybe you've gotten this from what I've said so far, the kind of sketchy nature of their planning suggests that the organizers of the rising weren't really interested in a military victory, but rather in a bold and dramatic gesture that would revive Irish Republican militancy. So the fighting began on Easter Monday when about 1,000 volunteers and 200 members, that is the Irish volunteers, 200 members of Connolly's citizen army, captured the General Post Office and a number of other sites in the center of Dublin. If you go to Dublin, you know, the General Post Office has this kind of iconic resonance for the Irish nation. It was it's like the, you know, the Liberty Bell or the sites in Philadelphia for Americans. So they captured the General Post Office with a fine sense of the drama of the moment. Patrick Pearse read a proclamation on behalf of what the rebels called the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic. That document is a foundational one, again, comparable to the American Declaration of Independence. But of course, badly outnumbered and outgunned, British troops rushed into the city. Fighting began and continued until the insurgents surrendered on Saturday, April 29th. So it lasted less than a week. In Dublin, 64 rebels had been killed, along with 132 soldiers, and then the largest group of all, civilians, about 230 civilians. The extensive use of artillery by the British devastated the center of Dublin. By most accounts, popular views the rebellion, that is, you know, the person on the street in Dublin, attitudes ranged from indifference to outright hostility to the rebels. What changed public attitudes was not the action taken by the rebels themselves, but that taken by the British government after the rising had been put down. Even though it occurred in the midst of World War I, most people in Ireland assumed that the leaders would be given prison sentences, well, perhaps long prison sentences, like those handed down to some earlier rebels. And instead, 15 men, including Pearse and Connolly and others, were charged with treason, given speedy trials in military courts, and then, to the shock of many, executed by firing squad in May. Connolly, sort of the most dramatic story is Connolly himself had been badly wounded. He had to be carried out on a stretcher into the yard in Kilmainham jail before he was executed. A 16th leader, a guy by the name of Sir Roger Casement, internationally known because of his writings that exposed the colonial atrocities in King Leopold's Congo, was hanged in August after being arrested while landing from a German submarine off the coast of County Kerry. As I said, it was the executions of these leaders rather than the rising itself that turned the tide of public opinion. Their perceived martyrdom, coming at a time when most Irish people still supported the moderates in the Home Rule movement, gave what's still in Ireland called physical force republicanism, that is revolutionary republicanism, a moral authority that it had not possessed for decades Okay. This in turn, I'm jumping ahead now quickly, this in turn led to a sweeping election victory by a relatively new political party called Sinn Féin, which means ourselves in Gaelic, in December 1918. So the month after the war ends, there are elections, and Sinn Féin it's just an utter landslide. In January 1919, Sinn Féin sets up a breakaway parliament in Dublin and elects Eamon de Valera, the highest ranking rebel who had survived the rising, as its leader. And then gradually the country devolves into a war of independence, very bloody war of independence, which comes to an end finally with the signing of a treaty with Britain in December 1921. The treaty did not create an independent Irish Republic, as people had hoped, many people had hoped, but rather gave dominion status, partial independence, to 26 of Ireland's 32 counties. So you can think of it as somewhere in between a republic and home rule, more than home rule, less than a republic. 6 of Ulster's counties, now constituted as Northern Ireland, however, remained in the United Kingdom and are still in the UK to this day. Okay, so that was my rapid tear through Irish history from 1916 to 1921 before I turn back to New York City and to share some of my own research. I'd be very happy to take questions or clarify anything I've said in this kind of very rapid overview.
Thank you, Professor. We do have a question.
Yeah.
Michael asks, okay, this I believe is in Gaelic. I'll try to pronounce it. What led you to an academic interest in, once again, Irish in America?
The Irish in America.
Yeah,
So,
could you please speak briefly about, oh, that's a second question, yes. So what led you to this interest?
great. So happy to address that. So I'm not Irish American. My background on my father's side is Ukrainian Jewish, near Kyiv, often in the news these days, of course. My interest grew out of American labor history and the really critically important role, especially in the 19th, early 20th century, that the Irish played in the building of the American labor movement. And so as I began to study American labor history, I began to study the thinking of so many of the people who were active in building that movement and their own sense of transnational connections to the place where they had come from. And then I have to say, I visited Ireland with my, eventually should be my wife, and visited Ireland for the first time. She is Irish American and was on sort of a roots kind of trip. But I just totally got bitten by the bug of this, as you can see, even just a little bit I've described, quite dramatic history of this country. Other questions, or shall I go on, David?
Mike, did you, well, here's another question, I can take it. Barry asks, why did the British Army have such a presence in Dublin at the time of the Rising?
Yeah, so reinforcements did have to be called in because they did have to be called in from other areas, and because there wasn't a huge presence. I mean, you know, from Britain's point of view, Ireland wasn't a colony. It was joined in a union with Great Britain. For many of the Irish nationalists that I'm talking about, especially the Republicans, it was actually a colony. And because there'd been intermittent revolutionary activity all from 1798 on, there was always somewhat of a British presence, but they weren't really in Dublin, and that's why the rebels, a handful of rebels, were able to take, you know, many important government buildings like that, and so it was only when the British came in, bombarded the city, that they were able to take back those sites. I think I got that question answered. So anything else, or shall I?
We have a couple more. There was
Sure,
a second half of the question from Michael. He's asked, could you speak briefly to the state of peace in Northern Ireland and the 6 counties, I guess, today,
Yeah.
especially if Sinn Féin wins plurality in the next election?
Yeah, well, sure, I'd be very happy to talk about that. I think we could well see it in the next decade of a vote along the lines established by the so-called Good Friday Agreement of 1998, that Britain would be pledged to honor a vote if we see a vote in both those 6 counties and the 26 counties of the Irish Republic. Britain is pledged to create to set the mechanisms in place that would lead to a united Ireland. So that's there on paper. I think there's some skepticism in certain quarters that will ever happen. Northern Ireland today is at peace compared with the period of the Troubles, but it's ethnically very, very divided to this day. If the questioner has traveled there, knows that the division between Protestant / loyalist communities and Catholic / Republican communities is deep. And so I think it's very possible that we'll see a united Ireland, but maybe not as quick as some people hope. But it's a great question. No one's really got the answer.
Florence asks, what was the nature of the coordination between the Germans and the IRA at the time?
So it's premature to talk about the IRA, but the forerunners of the IRA, the people I mentioned in the Irish Republican movement at the time, they were close connections, which I'll talk about the problematic nature of that later on in my talk, but they were connections that were facilitated actually in New York City by a group called Clan na Gael and its leader, John Devoy. And if you look, it's kind of a messy New York Times, but if you look down near the bottom, Devoy's statement is under inquiry. So people are already accusing Devoy of being, correctly actually, the link between the German government and the rebels in Ireland. Now you have to remember, US was not at war yet. US doesn't enter the war until 1917. So in 1916, the US is a neutral country, but the connections were real. The proclamation, and I'll probably misquote it, but the proclamation that I mentioned that Pierce reads at the General Post Office thanks both the Irish worldwide, the Irish diaspora, not in those words, but our allies in Europe, and the allies he means are the German military forces. So that's real, and it becomes a controversial and problematic thing as we get back into the New York context.
All right, we're still getting questions rolling in, so I don't know how you're feeling on time, how many you'd like to answer, but I'll give you let me know if you need to move on, and we can hold them to the end. But
yeah, we could move. How about one more and then hold the rest till the end?
Okay. Next question is from Kirk, pointing out that this is a topical subject. I'm wondering if you've seen the movie Belfast.
Yeah.
What you think of the film and how accurate it is.
So I thought it was I myself thought it was a great film. It's not necessarily a deeply political film, but as a kind of Kenneth Branagh's dealing with his upbringing, his past as a Protestant working class kid. I thought it was a beautiful film. I mean, I just loved it. One of my favorite films recently. There are great films that talk about some of the historical themes that I've just kind of run over. One of my favorite is When the Wind Shakes the Barley. The Wind Shakes the Barley by the British director Ken Loach, which really gets at this whole ferment in Irish history in this period. So that's one I'd highly recommend. Shall I move on? Will do. Okay, so as I said earlier, my own research focuses not on Ireland, but on the United States, and increasingly not just on the Irish, but on the interweaving of Irish nationalist movements with other movements. And so, so I think I said I'm really going to talk about three movements and three communities. I'll begin with the Irish. As the 20th century opened, decades of substantial Irish immigration. So migration out of Ireland begins even before the Great Famine of the 1840s and 1850s. But of course, that really ups the numbers. And then migration just continues. Oh, it really continues. I mean, even the film Ulster, in the end is a story of out-migration in the 1960s, 1970s, when that family leaves for Britain. So emigration is a fact of life in Ireland and has been for decades. So by the early 20th century, there were actually more Irish-born people living outside of Ireland than within its own borders, or more Irish-born and Irish-descended people living outside its borders. No city in the world better illustrates this than New York. Over 250,000 Irish-born people resided in the metropolis in 1900, making it, after Dublin and Belfast, the largest center of Irish population in the world. But the Irish-born doesn't really even get at the half of it, because the real demographic weight by the early 20th century lay not with the immigrants, but with the children of immigrants, or even with the grandchildren, now adult grandchildren of immigrants. And so Irish are just a force in the city and a force in many cities to be reckoned with. Irish Americans were still in this period overwhelmingly working class, but mostly skilled working class, strongly represented in New York's trade and transportation sectors, though by this time there were also small business owners, the owner of a neighborhood store or saloon, and then a handful of very wealthy Irish Americans. One person I've written about is the corporate attorney, John Quinn, who was, an accepted member of New York's urban elite. Irish nationalism in New York, as in Ireland, was divided into two wings. There were the physical force Republicans of Clan na Gael, who I've mentioned a couple of times now, and they had a presence there. But in the early years of the 20th century, in the US as in Ireland, the main show in town was the constitutional movement, Redmond's movement. And in America, an organization called the United Irish League of America, the UILA, which was the fundraising arm of Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party. But the balance of forces in the US changes dramatically with Redmond's decision to support the war effort and postpone home rule. And what's interesting, it changes more rapidly in the United States than it does in Ireland itself. Almost overnight, by the fall of 1914, put aside 1916, by the fall of 1914, the fortunes of the revolutionary wing are rising rapidly, and the constitutional, the moderate movement is in decline. So that you get to March of 1916, a new organization is born, not a secret organization, a very public organization called the Friends of Irish Freedom, born at a New York convention, attended by over 2,000 Irish American men and women. This is the month before the Easter Rising. Then when you get the Easter Rising, the execution of the leaders, and then moving on to 1919, the beginning of the War of Independence, American support for revolutionary Irish nationalism just explodes. It just explodes. So this organization I mentioned, the Friends of Irish Freedom, has nearly 300,000 members by 1919. It's later rivaled by, I'm going to say this quickly, it's a bunch of words, the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, which was founded by Eamon de Valera, leader of the movement back home during an 18-month organizing campaign in the US. By 1920, 700,000 members, had raised over $10 million for an Irish Republic that was only a hope and a dream, not recognized by any other countries, but it was raising money through the sale of bonds, and over $10 million. I'm not even sure how to translate in today's money. $10 million raised for the Irish Republic. Both these organizations had significant strength in New York, while smaller and sometimes more left-wing or radical organizations could be found here as well. And one that I've looked at in particular is a group called the Irish Progressive League, active from 1917 to 1920, which brought together anti-war liberals. By this time, US was at war, and for a big part of the left, anti-war sentiment was strong. Left-wing progressives, women's suffragists, socialists, all came together in the small but important organization called the Irish Progressive League. Okay, so that's one picture, one group. So let me turn to another group. So far smaller than the Irish American population in New York, there were nonetheless more than 60,000 African Americans living in the city at the beginning of the 20th century. That was already about 2% of the total population, and it grew over the next 2 decades. By 1914, Harlem alone counted over 50,000 Black residents. During the war years, New York's Black population grew rapidly, drawn not only from the American South, but also from the English-speaking islands of the Caribbean. While most Black New Yorkers, most Black New Yorkers experiencing segregated housing and racial discrimination that kept them restricted to the lowest paying jobs, the city also became a natural locale for a variety of protest movements. So the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in New York in 1909, and it was 1909 into 1910. And it was here that the Black scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois edited a magazine called The Crisis, which served not only as the NAACP's official monthly organ, but also as an important journal of thought and culture. Pan-Africanism, the doctrine holding that peoples of Africa and its diaspora had interests in common and in opposition to the European colonial powers that controlled the continent, was for the first years of the 20th century the preserve of a relatively small group of intellectuals, Du Bois himself being one of the most important. An important figure in its development. Beginnings are often dated with the so-called Pan-African Congress in London in July 1900 that Du Bois attended. However, with the emigration of Marcus Garvey from Jamaica to New York in March 1916, the situation changed dramatically. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which Garvey had founded in Jamaica in 1914, was a Pan-Africanist organization that from this point on, with really a world following, but that was from this point on headquartered in Harlem. Over the next few years, even in the United States, the UNIA grew dramatically, partly because of Garvey's talents as an orator and a writer, partly because of the activism of Black troops coming back from World War I and finding a very dispiriting resurgence of white racism throughout the nation. By the early 20s, the UNIA had chapters in more than 30 American cities, and Black supporters and some non-Black supporters that some historians estimate to number in the millions. Though Du Bois himself regarded Garvey with suspicion, even he had to admit the power of a movement that could bring thousands of people onto the streets of Harlem or into venues like Madison Square Garden for meetings or parades. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the third group, a much smaller group. In comparison to the size of either the Irish or Black communities, the number of South Asians in New York was very small. Although, and good history has been written on this in the last 10 or 15 years, although Indian merchants could be found in the city as early as the 18th century, substantial migration from the Indian subcontinent to North America only began in the early 20th and was then composed largely of Punjabi, Sikh agricultural and lumber workers who settled primarily in our area of the country on the Pacific coast. Among these migrants, whose total number never exceeded 10,000 before World War I, was an even smaller group of merchants, students, intellectuals, and professionals gravitated mainly to Western cities like Seattle or San Francisco, but some also made their way to New York, where as early as 1906, a small but growing number of Indian university students could be found. But despite these small numbers, North America became the base for a vibrant diasporic wing of Indian nationalism in these years. On the West Coast especially, a revolutionary organization called the Goddard Party emerged in 1913 that was shaped in equal measures, I would say, by opposition to British rule at home and opposition to the often violent anti-Asian racism that the migrants experienced in America. So I've talked about the West Coast, but New York was also an important center for radical anti-colonial activism as well. And now I'm going to jump to another figure, not a radical at this stage, but nonetheless, I'm going to quote from him, summarizing his interactions with other Indian activists in America during World War I. The moderate Indian nationalist Lala Lajpat Rai, pictured here in 1919 in New York City, observed unhappily that most of them, that is, most of the fellow nationalists he was encountering in New York and in the United States, were extremists. What did he mean by that? Like the Clan Nagale, which we talked about, served as a conduit for wartime contacts between the German government and Dublin rebels, many of New York's Indian nationalists were also, as Lajpat Rai noted disapprovingly, quote, in alliance with Germany and were being supplied with money by German government agents. However, a more moderate direction within the movement began to emerge with the arrival of Lajpat Rai himself. So I'm going to talk just briefly about his background. Born in very humble circumstances in Punjab, 1865, Lajpat Rai eventually became an accomplished lawyer and a leader, one of the leaders of the Indian National Congress. In April 1914, he left India on a political trip to Britain that he thought would last no more than a few months. But then the outbreak of war in August of 1914 changes his plans. He fears arrest if he went back to India. And so instead he sails for New York, where he resided for the next 5 years. In January 19, he founded the Indian Home Rule League of America, and the phrase home rule, comparable to the moderate Irish home rule movement, is not an accident. It expressed a commonality of sentiment. But the goal of the Indian Home Rule League of America in particular was to make the Indian question an international one, and especially to reach out to sympathetic Americans, of whom there were a considerable number. To further this goal, the group began publishing an influential monthly magazine called Young India. You can find it online, fascinating reading, in my opinion. And so this kind of activism was building. British intelligence agents watched these developments with increasing concern. And I have to say that I've also worked in the National Archives in London and looked at the reports of British intelligence agencies, British intelligence agents back to the British government. And they're thick on the ground in cities like New York and Boston and Chicago and San Francisco. And what they're most concerned about is the possibility of connections being established between Indian nationalists and New York's and other cities' growing contingent of Irish Republicans. So that's what British intelligence is worried about. We as historians, though, have to take a step back, I think, and ask ourselves, well, is this a fantasy or is this a reality? How real is this threat? And how real was the parallel threat of Irish Republicans making common cause with Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, which appears to have been of even greater concern to the US Intelligence Bureau, and this is the forerunner of the FBI, whose young leader, J. Edgar Hoover, regarded Marcus Garvey as the foremost radical among his race and a serious threat to the entire social order. This is Marcus Garvey. So what can we say about this? So I'll try to take these questions up. In the case of Garvey, we now know that contacts and influences were highly significant. And the key scholar was a guy back in the 70s and 80s by the name of Robert Hill, still active, the leading scholar of the UNIA, but it's been borne out by subsequent work showing that Irish nationalism played an absolutely central role in Garvey's entire political outlook. And I'll say I could go on and on about this, but I'll just say the Easter Rising had an especially large impact on Garvey. He found the willingness of its leaders to give up their lives for the sake of a larger cause to be highly admirable. In his dedication of Liberty Hall, the UNIA's Harlem headquarters in July 1919, Garvey proclaimed that, quote, "The time has come for the Negro race to offer up its martyrs upon the altar of liberty, even as the Irish had given a long list from Robert Emmet to Roger Casement." Well, I've told you who Roger Casement is. Emmet was much earlier a leader of a rebellion in 1803 and was hanged afterwards. And it's great, great tradition of paying homage to Robert Emmet in Ireland, but also among figures like Garvey. Even the name, and this is what Robert Hill showed quite a long time ago, even the name Liberty Hall in Harlem reflected Garvey's appreciation for this sacrifice. He'd named it after Liberty Hall in Dublin, the headquarters of the Irish Citizen Army. In a Carnegie Hall speech the following month, so this is August 1919, Garvey returned to the theme. From the time of Robert Emmet to the time of Roger Casement, Ireland has been fighting, agitating, offering up her sons as martyrs. Just as such people bled and died for Ireland, so we who are leading the UNIA are prepared at any time to free Africa and free Negroes of the world. So connections between Garvey and Irish Republicans. So what we have to remember are the really deep currents of Irish American racism, white American racism, but the Irish have been shapers of a tradition of American racism throughout their history. I mean, from before the draft riots of the 1860s and after the anti-busing riots of the 1970s and beyond, that this is a pretty overwhelming tradition of hostility towards African Americans, which makes the connections that were established, to my mind, all the more interesting and at first surprising, but especially among the left wing of the New York Irish Republican community, the liberals and feminists and socialists of the Irish Progressive League, there was reciprocal enthusiasm. So let me give you a quote from an Irish leader by the name of Helen Golden, who met with leaders of the UNIA in 1920. And after that meeting, she said, the organization has inaugurated a history-making movement whose goal of eliminating all race prejudice deserves the support of all Irish Republicans. Now, so the Garvey-Irish connection, odd as it might seem to us, is very real. I should note that Du Bois, whose work, and if you read his autobiographies, and which he wrote 3 actually different versions of his autobiography, talks a lot about growing up among the Irish of New England, and he talks a lot about Irish American racism. So he's more skeptical, and he's more skeptical of Ireland's turn to revolution in 1916. He laments in the crisis the 1916 execution of Roger Casement, but rather than praising Casement's heroic sacrifice the way that Garvey had done, he simply focuses on Britain's political misstep in executing him. And this is, you could see this, it was a misstep to execute the 15 after the Rising ended. It was a misstep to execute a Casement. That's clearly Du Bois was right. But that was really the gist of his point of view. By 1920, however, Du Bois has changed his view entirely. He's now an active supporter of Irish independence, joins a distinguished group of social reformers and politicians called the so-called Committee 100 to place the Irish case before the tribunal of the civilized world. That's a quote. As was the case, and I'm wondering how I'm doing on time, Mike or David, and what can you tell me in terms of, given that we took some time for questions, how much?
We have, it's 20 after 7, so, we have until 8 o'clock. So, I think you're fine.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, if you want to break me at some point and go to questions, that's fine too. But if not, I'll just keep plugging along. I find this stuff so interesting and still learning as I'm working on this subject. So there's divisions in all these groups. Pan-Africanists, Du Bois and Garvey do not see eye to eye, nor do Indian nationalists, moving back to them, see eye to eye on either the wisdom or, you could say the morality or the ethics of the 1916 rebellion in Dublin. Now, not surprisingly, the revolutionary wing of the Indian independence movements embraces the Easter Rising. So in May 1916, San Francisco's Goddard newspaper hails the leaders of the rebellion, compares them to Robert Emmet, again, as Garvey had done, and proclaims that in Ireland, the blood of martyrs is not wasted. This martyrdom is clearly a key theme that helps make the connections that are being made. On the other hand, the more moderate Lajpat Rai, who opposed insurrectionists among his fellow Indian nationalists, felt the same way about their Irish counterparts, at least at the beginning. He was much more inclined to relate to home rulers, like I think I mentioned the corporate attorney, John Quinn. Lajpat Rai and Quinn become good friends, and Quinn, and it makes sense. They're sort of on the same page politically. But remember what I told you about this explosion of support for Irish republicanism. So Lajpat Rai was also a pragmatist, and he and others see this rising tide of popular support for full Irish independence in the United States. And he begins to develop relationships with Irish and Irish American Republicans as well. A key point in his journey is his decision to join a new body called the Friends of Freedom for India in the fall of 1919. This organization's national council boasted a number of eminent Americans, including the anthropologist Franz Boas and the reformer Upton Sinclair and novelist Upton Sinclair. But it was New York's Irish Republicans who provided the most vigorous American support for the new organization. Frank Walsh, a well-known attorney, Irish-American attorney who'd led an Irish-American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference and would go on to play an important role as De Valera's US legal advisor, became a vice president of Friends of Freedom for India, while the similarly named Friends of Irish Freedom provided a good deal of moral and financial support. So other new organizations are emerging as well. And one of the most interesting ones to me is an organization, there are a couple of these like this, but I'll just focus on one tonight, that represent not a single group, but what we might call a broad anti-colonial front. And so for me, the most interesting when I came across it was an organization called the League of Oppressed Peoples, held its first meeting in New York in November 1919. So a couple of historians have mentioned this outfit in passing, but I think it needs much, much more attention than it's received so far. As I began to research its history, I was struck first by the sweeping ambition of its goals: to defeat militaristic aggression everywhere in the world and to secure self-determination for all peoples. A very global view of self-determination, far more sweeping than Woodrow Wilson's. I was also struck with the list of names that I did know that were associated with this organization. The women's suffrage leader, Harriet Stanton Blatch, the philosopher, Will Durant, the minister of the social gospel, Protestant minister, Norman Thomas, progressive reformer, Frederick Howe, well-known figures in their day. It wasn't only the League's expansive goals or its famous names, though, that caught my attention. It was also its distinctive structure, which appeared to be a kind of radical mirror of that much more familiar league, the League of Nations. Numerous nations were represented in this new league, but none of those had been recognized at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference because they were all, or mainly at least, colonial possessions of the great powers that dominate the conference. So at its peak in late 1920, this New York-based organization, the League of Oppressed Peoples, had formal, if I have to say self-appointed, representatives from China, Egypt, India, Ireland, and Korea. Two of the people I mentioned this evening, Lajpat Rai and Du Bois, were central to its activities. Lajpat Rai represented India. Du Bois spoke on behalf of Africa. But from the standpoint of my focus this evening, the main point I want to make, again, I think I'm hammering this home, is the centrality of Irish and Irish American Republicans in the history of this, to my mind, very interesting organization. In fact, the original idea for the League of Oppressed Peoples came from Frank Walsh, with financial support from yet another anti-colonial activist, Said Zaghloul, who had led the Egyptian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. So the Paris Peace Conference is really a meeting of great powers deciding on the future of the world. But there are a variety of groups kind of knocking at the door of the conference and not being let in. Irish Americans led by Frank Walsh are one, Pan-Africanists led by Du Bois are another, and an Egyptian delegation led by Said Zaghloul are yet another. None of them were successful there. But what did happen in Paris, and it's happening in New York, but it's happening in Paris too, is that these outsiders are making contact with each other. So Zaghloul approaches Walsh in Paris and asks him to serve as the Egyptian consul in the United States. So it's similar to the role he plays for De Valera. He's De Valera's consul. He's the Egyptian consul as well. He's provided $90,000 in expenses and fees. Once back in New York, he pays some of that to journalists to cover more Egyptian affairs. He used some of it to pay the expenses of one of his associates to present the Egyptian case before the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. But he uses $2,000 of the Egyptian money to found this League of Oppressed Peoples. The idea really comes from Frank Walsh via this roundabout way, Paris making contact with other anti-colonial figures there. Walsh is a fascinating guy. He was one of the founding figures in the American Civil Liberties Union. For example, his records in the New York Public Library just go on for box after box after box. His correspondence, he kept everything, and it's, you know, he was into many different things. But one of his major commitments is this broad anti-colonial activism. In the end, however, the most important individual in the League was not Walsh, but a guy by the name of Dudley Field Malone. This is my last illustration. Born to a prosperous New York Irish-American family in 1882, Malone received a law degree from Fordham in 1905. He was a Reform Democrat. Woodrow Wilson, because of his support for Wilson, appoints him to a position as controller of the Port of New York. But Malone resigns his post in the summer of 1917, a dramatic protest of the administration's failure to endorse women's suffrage. The progressive reformer Frederick Howe, who I mentioned, described Malone as, quote, a magnetic personality in any group. He went on, actually had a short-lived role in the 1940s as a Hollywood actor. So a magnetic personality in any group. He was gifted with extraordinary ability as a public speaker, richly endowed personality, and a generosity, possessed generosity that went out to causes only less wholeheartedly than it went out to personal friends. Well, not surprisingly, one of Malone's main causes was Irish republicanism, and he worked with De Valera on the American tour that I mentioned. But his main efforts in this period were focused primarily on the forging of links of mutual support and cooperation between Irish activists and those representing other nationalities. So going back to the meeting I mentioned between Helen Golden and other lead, not Garvey himself, but other leaders of Garvey's movement, it was Malone who arranged that meeting between the Irish Progressive League and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And when he later spoke at Harlem's Liberty Hall in October of 1920, on the subject of Irish freedom, He was, according to Marcus Garvey, the first white person ever to do so. Malone, again, was so connections with Garvey, but Malone was also vice president, one of the vice presidents of the Friends of Freedom for India, and also developed what he called an abiding friendship with Lala Lajpat Rai, quote, the most modest but most inspiring patriot I've ever known. It was, in my view, direct personal interactions like these, efforts to link people's, I'm going to go back to the quote I gave you at the beginning from Mary Louise Pratt, efforts to link, quote, peoples geographically and historically separated in the metropolitan contact zone that was World War I era New York, that made Malone the natural leader of an organization that aspired to speak not only for Ireland, India, or Africa, but those that it called oppressed peoples generally. I have some more here, you know, Mike and David, but that's an okay breaking point as well. And so if you'd like to turn it over to questions, I'd be happy to take a shot at them. And then if there's time, I can go back and sort of make some concluding remarks that I was going to make.
That sounds excellent. So the questions do keep coming in, and please feel free to add more. Barbara asks how she wants to focus on the role of political bosses in America in this movement. And she mentions Mayor Hagen, Jersey City, and Pendergast in Kansas City as examples. How do you think the Easter Uprising influenced the Irish Americans became political bosses?
So it's a great question. And the bosses are an important part of Irish American history. They, other ethnic groups get in on the act as well by the time we get to the mid 20th century. But the Irish are really the pioneers of the political machine, and and their main concern. I mean, I don't think of this group as a very idealistic group, but they see the handwriting on the wall. So most of the Irish politicians after 1916 are very much on board with Irish revolutionary nationalism for their own purposes. That's where their followers are going. That's where they're going to go as well. So on De Valera does this amazing cross-country tour in 1919, 1920, and in every city he's greeted by committed idealistic Irish nationalists like the ones I'm talking about, but he's also greeted by every major American city mayor, and not just the Irish too. I mean, it's just he was a kind of celebrity in his day, and so the political machines turn out. So I think that's the quick answer to that question.
Thanks, David. Next question. Oh, and I'll just invite the audience, right? Keep sending us in your questions, and if you want to scan through the list of questions and upvote, you can help us decide which ones to ask first. A question from Richard. Where did the Irish people originally come from in ancient times?
Where did they come from in settling the island of Ireland? So I am not up to speed on the latest research, but I will tell you this, that despite, words like Clan Gael, the Gaels the Celts were not the only group that settled the island of Ireland. And new research, which again, it's not my field, it's way before my time, but I've kept up with it enough to know that it's a very mixed group of migrants who've ended up on that island of Ireland. And that's important because it kind of runs against what I think are kind of founding national myths of the nation itself. It's a more diverse, and even cosmopolitan is probably the wrong word, but a more diverse group of people than used to be thought.
Elizabeth notes that this is a fascinating history and much needed. Have you come across the Women's Irish Education League, founded in San Francisco in May 1919 by Kathleen O'Brennan and other Irish American women?
I absolutely have, and had time permitted me, I could have talked about women's activism in San Francisco, in New York. Well, I guess I did mention the Irish Progressive League, but Helen Golden was the leader of that. It was not a women's organization, but women were prominent in its leadership. In Boston, in Chicago, where Margaret Haley, who was the pioneer leader of the teachers union there and of teachers unions everywhere across the country, really Irish American, was also active in Irish Republican activities. So women, and this is one of the things I did try to do in my longer history of Irish nationalism, is really place women at the center of the story in ways that, I have to say previous historians of the movement in America hadn't done. And it's going on in Ireland itself, the interactions of a nation feminist movement in Ireland with the Irish Republican movement, is getting a lot of good research recently. The Irish Parliamentary Party, though, that I mentioned, John Redmond's group, was utterly opposed to giving the vote to women. So, it put that moderate group on the wrong side of the suffrage question right off the bat. But yes, I have come across the San Francisco group that you mentioned.
Next question is from Barry. To what extent does the idea of, quote, my enemy's enemy is my friend, unquote, explain Garvey's unlikely admiration of the otherwise anti-Black prejudiced Irish American group?
I think that phrase comes into play in a number of ways in this whole history. And I do think that that's part of Garvey's, Garvey, when he looks at the liberation of Africa, who is his enemy? His enemy is the British Empire. Which group at that particular moment, have struck the hardest at the British Empire? It is the Irish. So I do think that's part of it. I do also think, though, as the quotes that I've given you indicate, there's another level at which it's not just the enemy of my enemy. It's also something about the willingness to sacrifice oneself. I mean, the people who participate in the Easter Rising, I should have said this more strongly than I said, they didn't really have a chance. I mean, they just didn't have a chance. And so to go ahead and to take that stand, it did bring them the admiration of all sorts of groups and figures, including Garvey. I think the admiration was real. But that other piece is definitely part of it as well. Thank you.
Barry notes that it seems like the executions really triggered the Republican movement. And so would you say that the British government regretted that action?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'm sure some people in the British government did, on reflection, think it was the worst blunder they could have made. Just like Du Bois, I quoted Du Bois, this is a blunder. I think people did. Those who weren't executed were imprisoned, but they weren't imprisoned for long periods of time. And that's why people like De Valera were back out on the street campaigning for election by the time you get to 1918. They were interned rather than, they were never tried, but they were released pretty soon. And I think the idea was, let's just stop making martyrs. I have to say, because there was a question earlier about Northern Ireland, when you jump to 1981 and the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland and Margaret Thatcher lets 10 people die, people at the time said, it's a blunder, just like those earlier executions back in 1916. I think Bobby Sands he wasn't convicted of murder. He was the most famous of the hunger strikers. Wasn't convicted of murder, but he was a member of the IRA. He was, by most people's consideration, a terrorist. When Margaret Thatcher let him and the other 9 die on hunger strike, it created a wave, this kind of history repeating itself. 100,000 people were at Bobby Sands' funeral. 100,000 in maybe the person who asked the question about Belfast knows that's an awful lot of people in not a huge city. So So yeah, you do see this, and I can't think of a particular person in the British government who said, "Oh, what a huge mistake," but I think there was a rethinking of that in the short term anyway.
A question from Stephanie. Thank you so much, Dr. Brundage. This work shows how these groups' disparate anti-colonial efforts reveal the complexities and insidiousness of British colonial logic, which is fascinating. Could you speak more about how these movements of contact might have directly influenced later efforts by the US government to police, survey, and punish long-distance nationalism, for example, Japanese Americans in World War II?
That's a terrific question. Yeah, I think, the secret services of the world share approaches and strategies and surveillance techniques, which got, of course, more sophisticated as you go through history. And most certainly, even in the period that I'm talking about, the Bureau of Intelligence in the United States, military and U.S. Army military intelligence, which I could have mentioned if I'd continued on here, is sharing methods and information with British intelligence, and the notions that I do think, I hadn't really thought about it quite this way as I'm going to say it right now, but just as you have long distance nationalists or long distance anti-colonialists, you have long distance counter techniques too. And Garvey is a great example because every secret service in the world, every colonial power in the world, secret service is interested in Marcus Garvey because his goal is not just to empower African Americans in this country, but to liberate Africa from European rule. So yeah, so that's a really great question.
Kirk brings up the movie All the Americans Men and Deep Throat, who said, follow the money.
Follow the money.
Who profited from Ireland becoming a separate country?
Who profited from Ireland becoming a separate country? Well, in the short run, it's hard to see who profited. Ireland, well, this is sort of, if I want to go back to Irish history, that Anglo-Irish treaty that I mentioned was so controversial that it sparked what's called the Irish Civil War, which began basically in 1922, 100 years ago. This month or next month, June is really when the fighting really breaks out, which is between two groups of Irish Republicans fighting over the nature of the treaty. And this is a very sad period of Irish history. And when the smoke clears, what's left is what's called the Free State government, the pro-treaty side had won, but the country is really impoverished and remains so through the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and off and on through the whole 20th century. So certainly it was a disappointment to the vision of, the vision of this guy on the screen, but certainly the vision of people like Connolly and Pierce, the kind of stagnation of the Irish economy. When you get to the early 20th century and the so-called Celtic Tiger and high tech and EU membership, there's a burst of like, oh, there's a different economic reality in our future. And then you get to the 08-09 downturn, and Ireland is just ravaged by that. Emigration on a large scale begins again. Young people begin to say, we're the people in their 20s and 30s in 2008 begin to talk about themselves as the lost generation. So Ireland has never had the kind of the prosperous emigration-free future that the people who went out to the streets in Dublin in 1916 envisioned. And that's I think it's a tragedy of the nation, I think. Well,
I have a question from Dawn, who happens to be my freshman year roommate. So
Okay.
hi, Don, and
Hi, Don.
thanks for tuning in. At some point, we came to correlate the Republican movement with religious nationalism.
Yeah.
I note that early anti-colonial advocates were of varying religious backgrounds. When and why did it become viewed as a religious struggle, and did it have an impact on how the movement was viewed?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So yes, the actors that I'm talking about in this period in New York are Hindu, are Catholic, are Protestant, are secular, and they aren't seeking to put a religious stamp on their movement. I mean, it's just not what they're thinking about at all. In the context of Ireland, which I know the best, even there, Irish Republican organizations like the current Sinn Féin or the IRA. I don't think the IRA really exists anymore, but these groups claim over and over again to be non-denominational, non-sectarian, ecumenical, and to specifically embrace in the Irish context Catholics and Protestants both. That's a deep tradition in Irish republicanism. On the ground, however, on the ground, the story has always been different, and it's been Irish Protestants who most favored, whether we're talking about right in the present day or back in the period that I'm talking about, it's been Irish Protestants who most favored keeping the connection with Britain, and Catholics who were most actively seeking to break that connection. So that's not an answer to the question. It's just a statement that, there's the official stance, and then there's the reality formed by, again, Belfast, the film Belfast, I go back to that, is quite good on the sense of like, how do you enforce religious sectarianism? Well, one of the characters is a kind of thug on the streets who's definitely enforcing religious sectarianism, but his counterparts existed in the Catholic community as well. So it's a great hard question, I think.
I'm going to slide in one of my own, bridging off the last one. My understanding is that in the American Revolutionary War, Northern Irish radicals were instrumental in our own revolution against the English. What happened that the Protestants moved towards unionism?
So it's a version of the previous question. I don't know I can answer it any better, except to say, David, you're absolutely right that it's not only that Irish Protestants in America and at the time of the American Revolution, the majority of the migrants to the U.S. were Presbyterian or Anglican. They were mostly Protestant. Did really embrace the American Revolution, but it's also true that the American Revolution inspired groups like the late 1790s organization, the United Irishmen, which led a rebellion in 1798, and which, as its name indicated, was about bringing together Protestant and Catholic in a movement for political independence, inspired by the American Revolution, inspired by the French Revolution. Fascinating organization and movement, the United Irishmen, and if one of the kind of touchstones that contemporary Irish Republicans look back to is the Easter Rising, they also look back to the United Irishmen. So Jerry Adams, he'll give speeches at the grave of Wolfe Tone, who was a Protestant, leader of the United Irishmen back in 1798. So again, there's this, on the surface, this is richly anti-sectarian. But again, so what explains more and more Protestants convince themselves that well, I'll say the phrase that was popular in the 1880s from the Protestant point of view: home rule will actually be Rome rule. Home rule will not lead to a secular society in which we Protestants will be recognized, but it will lead to a domination of Protestants by the Roman Catholic Church. And so that became one of the real driving forces of unionism, that fear of being swamped in a Catholic country. And I think it's still at work in Northern Ireland, even though it's a relatively small population, but the Protestant population in the Republic is doing just fine. I mean, they tend to be better off than the Catholic population. So.
With that, I think we've come to the end of our time for questions. Did you have a summary, some summary points you wanted to come, and then I'll come back to some final.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, obviously, I have a particular stance towards the information that I'm sharing with you in the research. I mean, I find these connections that were made, I'm an objective historian looking to find the truth as best as I can find it. But one of the reasons I'm attracted to this story is I'm struck by the idealism and the foresight of individuals and groups that I'm looking at. So for me, if I were going to try to bring this to an end, I would say, well, okay, well, what happened to this over the course of the 1920s? And I don't really want to get into that, but I do think it's incumbent on historians, if we're going to explore this kind of explosion of this kind of movement, how does it kind of fall apart over the course of the 20s and into the 30s? And I have some ideas about that, but I think I'll leave that for an essay or something I'm working on. Yeah, no, I think that's a fine place to end. I know you did want to ask me about possible contributions, financial contributions, and so I will mention, and maybe Diana can put up the website. I will mention that I would urge, if people want to make a financial contribution to some aspect of our work at UC Santa Cruz, the Humanities Institute, which in addition to hosting numerous public events in Santa Cruz and also online, it was especially before COVID, but now picking up again. Just went to a great event at the Museum of Art and History on the Filipino community of Watsonville, called Watsonville in the Heart. So the Humanities Institute has been a sponsor of public events like that, but also provides indispensable financial and professionalization support for graduate students in the humanities at UCSC. So strongly urge you to get behind their work.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Professor. This has been a wonderful evening. And I would ask everybody to give a big round of applause down in the Q&A box. I know it started already.
Great.
Thank you for sharing your insights this evening. I note again, it's been recorded and it will be available in the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lecture YouTube channel in a few days. Once again, please contribute to the Humanities Institute. I think you've seen the fine product that comes out of its influence.
And since I'm looking here, I want to particularly say hi to Sean Prendeville, to Elizabeth Creeley, to my neighbor Sharon Kenoshita. Great day. I didn't realize you were on the call, but nice to have you all here.
Wonderful.
Great.
I'd also like to extend a big round of thanks to the Alumni Relations and University Events Offices who organized this webinar. Thank you, Shana, Diana, Paulina, and Kristen. Our next event will be on Monday, May 9th, and will feature art professor Jennifer Parker, founding director of UCSC's Open Lab. Jennifer investigates methods of arts integration in higher education by combining creative research practices with science, engineering, and technology. In this discussion, we'll likely hear about the Algae Society, BioArt Design Lab, and more. Join us to hear how science, technology, and art mesh. Now in a week, the Alumni Week kicks off. It'll be run this year in hybrid, virtual, and in-person mode from April 19th to 24th, and will include over 70 events throughout the week. There are many inspirational and engaging opportunities for any slug. Here's a smattering of events that are exciting to me: a review of drone programs on campus, as well as drone demos, a behind-the-scenes visit to the Younger Lagoon Reserve Bird Banding Station, the Banana Slug Shares highlighting 5 alumni sharing their expertise on a variety of topics. Cheers to 30 years, a beer and wine reception celebrating the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Alumni Association Scholarship Fund. You'll find more about these and dozens of other enticing events at alumniweekend.ucsc.edu. That's alumniweekend.ucsc.edu, and I think you find a link at the bottom. On behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you for joining us. And please come back on May 9th at 6:30 for our next virtual event. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.